Next Chapter Podcasts.
Say, light me up with sweet water, lay me down in the fiery lake. Pour me out till I'm dead and gone. I'm gonna drown my soul. Say, light me up with sweet water, lay me down in the fiery lake.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and don't nobody want to hear it, but it's like this the South got something to say.
Welcome to Our New South, a podcast series presented by Levine Museum of the New South in Charlotte, North Carolina. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofthenewsouth.org. Hi, my name is Kevin Blackistone, sports columnist at the Washington Post, coming to you from College Park, Maryland, where I teach journalism at the University of Maryland.
And I'm Dr. Robert Greene II. I'm an associate professor of history at Claflin University in Orangeburg, South Carolina.
On season 3 of the podcast, we're welcoming 10 influential Southerners to share insights from their lives and careers, as well as their thoughts on the New South and its future.
We thank you for joining us on this journey and for making the show a Signal Award, Communicator Award, and Anthem Award winner.
Follow the show, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and for the first time, we're now publishing portions of our interviews on YouTube.
Go to youtube.com and search Levine Museum.
Okay, let's get to today's episode of the show.
The South got something to say.
This episode of Our New South examines the power of music to transcend borders, exploring how intersecting identities of gender, faith, and heritage are redefining what it means to be a Texan and a Southerner.
Our guest is Latin Grammy nominee and Austin native Gina Chavez. A U.S. cultural ambassador, Chavez blends English and Spanish to create a sound that NPR calls confident and refreshing. And as the co-founder of the Niñas Arriba College Fund in El Salvador, she uses her platform to amplify marginalized voices and declare that she is la que manda, the woman in charge. But before we get to that conversation, it's time for this episode's trivia question. Robert?
As you know, throughout this season, we're testing our listeners' knowledge of the South with a good bit of trivia. Now, Kevin, are you ready?
Of course I'm ready.
Okay, we'll see. Don't be the Atlanta Falcons with trivia here now. Okay. Now, which famous street is a hub for music in the city of Austin, Texas? Your choices are A, Frenchman Street, B, 6th Street, C, Broadway, or D, Beale Street. Of course, we'll reveal the answer at the end of this episode.
Okay, now before we get to our guests, I would like to ask Dr. Robert Greene II to provide us with some historical context to set the stage for our conversation.
Out of all the major and well-known cities in Texas, no place has a more eclectic reputation than Austin. The home to the University of Texas at Austin, the city has become a hub of Texan culture, music, and art, building for itself a reputation as a major cultural center in the New South. The South by Southwest event has taken place in Austin since 1987 and is a combination of music, film, and other media events. Numerous other art and cultural festivals are held in Austin year-round. It is not a surprise, therefore, that the music of Austin-born Gina Chavez reflects the cultural and artistic diversity of her life growing up in Texas. Austin's older residents have, in recent years, coined the term "Keep Austin Weird." For them, Austin's bohemian heritage is a critical part of the city's DNA. Like other southern cities that have a reputation for art and culture, such as New Orleans, Charleston, or Nashville, Austin has seen both economic benefits from the artistic history and the growing problems of gentrification and fears of loss of a unique cultural identity. Meanwhile, Austin's reputation as a progressive college town also makes it stand out in a state, Texas, often associated with conservative politics, even as the state itself becomes more purple and politically diverse. Gina Chavez's own background as a musician reflects the changing dynamics of Austin in particular, and Texas, more broadly speaking. Growing up in Austin with parents of Mexican and Swiss German descent, Chavez was influenced by numerous musical styles. At UT Austin, Chavez built her career as a singer-songwriter. While in college, her travels and studies in Buenos Aires, Argentina, pushed Chavez to also incorporate music from Latin America into her broad collection of influences. Now, as an acclaimed singer, Chavez writes lyrics in both English and Spanish. Chavez's work has numerous influences, from her parents to her relationship with Latin America and her reconciling her queer identity with a Christian belief system. For Chavez, as is the case for many from Austin, however, these are merely part of a larger, broader identity. The weird that many Austin residents maintain makes them a unique cultural hub that everyone loves and cherishes.
And now I'd like to introduce a genre-bending musician, philanthropist, and proud Austinite. Our New South welcomes Gina Chavez.
Hello, great to be with you.
And, I want to start off our interview today by asking you a few questions about the place you're from, Austin, Texas. Of course, many of our listeners and viewers, when they hear the name Austin, Texas, they think of three things. It's the capital of Texas. It is, of course, one of the bluer, more progressive areas of Texas. It's also the home to the University of Texas at Austin. And perhaps most importantly for this episode, it is also a music hotbed. It's the home of South by Southwest. It's well known for a vibrant and great music scene. But I think also most of our listeners may not be aware of the fact that it has a large Latinx population as well. Over 300,000 Latinx people live in Austin, Texas. So let's start off today's interview by asking you a bit about what it was like growing up in Austin, Texas as a Swiss German Latina. What was it like living in a Latinx community in the heart of Texas and the Deep South?
Yeah, great question. I feel like I have to kind of, especially for those who are not viewing us, I have to call out that, I am very light-skinned. I walk through the world as a white person. I definitely grew up, kind of like I would say a middle class, lower middle class family, pretty modest upbringing, but definitely in a lot of ways don't necessarily have the lived experience of a lot of Latinx people here in Austin, or in Texas. And so on some level, my experience has been largely that, being Latina, singing in Spanish, for instance, has been a benefit because I think I definitely check boxes for people, They're like, oh, cool, like queer, basically like white, but also Latina, and so I want to call that out just to say, I don't really feel like I can speak for people other than maybe people who grew up not speaking Spanish. Mm-hmm. It's like having those roots, but then essentially having them taken from, like my parents, for instance, my dad, he grew up speaking English. He grew up at a time where his parents, and this was in the south side of San Antonio, where, he really loved and was very drawn to American culture. Like he loved Elvis Presley and baseball and, Chevys. And I think in a similar way, I grew up and was always very drawn to my Latinx roots without necessarily having access to them. So anyway, I think this is a funny story my mom always likes to tell me is I go to middle school, Lamar Middle School in Austin, Texas, I'm definitely a product of great public schools here in Austin. And apparently I came back and I said something about the real Mexican girls to my mom. And my mom was like, well, who are the real Mexican girls? And I was like, the ones with like the really big hair and they have like, cans of hairspray and they're just, and I was not, I think from a young kid, I never quite fit in anywhere. And so I ended up being one of those people who could kind of, exist in different pockets and be welcomed in those pockets, but never really found a home anywhere. So I think that would actually probably be more my experience. And especially, I didn't realize that I was queer until 24.
Mhm.
And now looking back on my childhood, I'm like, oh my God. Like I never, I'd go over to sleepovers with all the girls and everybody's pulling out their Clinique makeup bags and talking about boys. And I would just kind of like pretend. I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah. And so now I look back and I'm like, oh my God, I never fit in there either, So I would just say not fitting in would be my experience.
Well, and yet at the same time, you just mentioned how your father loves Elvis Presley, baseball, and Chevys. He sounds like a
Yeah.
pretty Southern guy to me, just based on that description alone. But
True.
I am curious as to what it was like growing up as the daughter of immigrants in Texas. What were some of the experiences, kind of branching off from that question, that you experienced growing up? And then to add to that, with immigration being in the news today, being a prominent part of our national political discourse, what do you think are some of the current challenges facing immigrants coming to the South right now?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say I'm probably like third generation North American on both sides.
Mhm, mhm.
Meaning that, like my grandfather on my mom's side, he was from kind of a Cleveland, Ohio farm, like very rural farm area. He was a bombardier in World War II. My mom was born in Richardson. And then his dad actually died when he was about 10. And so he didn't really know his own father, much less did we ever really get to know him. I do think the musical lineage comes from Adan Eugenio, who was my dad's father. And then my grandmother remarried and she married a white man. And so, it's like we would go to San Antonio, which was kind of the closest thing I had to my Latinx roots. And we might go to mass in Spanish and we would visit my great aunt Lupe and she only spoke Spanish. And those were kind of my only like touch points with, I remember sitting with her, I don't even know how old I was, and just being like, oh, like we can't talk. Like I don't know what she's saying, like, and that being weird, right? I mean, as far as immigrants and immigration, I'm a firm believer that this country, we are who we are because of immigrants. We are built on the backs of immigrants, people who came here without wanting to, people who came here because they wanted to, and we continue to be a nation of immigrants. I wouldn't be here if people didn't cross borders, And then I think about things like, how borders are just lines. They're just man-made lines. Birds don't abide by lines. They don't abide by our borders. Insects, they're walking in your house. They don't care that you have a door. You know what I mean? Like, and so the idea that we draw these lines and we claim something as our own is kind of laughable, I didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I took Spanish in 6th, 7th, 8th grade, like most kids did, in Texas at least. And and I liked Spanish. I've always been the child that's like more drawn to my Latin roots than like my brother. It was kind of like I was the brown child and he was the white child. But I've always had this kind of like affinity for my lost Latin roots. And because I didn't grow up within kind of the trappings of a particular, it's like I'm half Mexican by raíces, but like I didn't really grow up Mexican or Tex-Mexican, And so as a result, as I've traveled to Latin American countries, I kind of just get to be a sponge and pick up whatever I find interesting. And so then it's like I go to Argentina and I start playing chacarrera. And so it's like I'm really not fitting boxes at this point. It's like, oh, I'm playing a charango, which is an Andean instrument from the Andes Mountains, playing a cumbia, singing in English and Spanish, and people are kind of like, what? I don't know what it is, but I like it, And so again, it kind of reminds me, I think for a long time I had a lot of shame around, oh, I don't play like traditional cumbia or I don't know what I'm doing. And then again, I return to something like nature and you're just like, yeah, birds have the song that they sing whatever they're going to sing, and they don't, and the idea that migration itself is so innate to our humanity, which is exactly why the things that, power likes to control are our bodies and our movement.
Interesting. Well, I must tell you, the two women in my household wished that insects respected borders.
Don't we all? Don't we all?
Your answers to those first two questions lead me to something. And that's that you are so intentional in your music in being bilingual.
Mm.
And you are in a state where some of those politicians have declared that they would like an English only rule. They haven't been successful in the state, but they have with truckers and instituting some sort of English language requirement. And so I'm just wondering, why are you so intentional with your bilingualism in this atmosphere that we're in the South, in the state of Texas? And given the fact that you just revealed that you didn't speak Spanish coming up, that you learned it in school, and when I listened to your music, I would have assumed that you grew up with that as part of your tongue.
So I think there is a different voice that I access. And I think I mean that in a sonic sense as well as a soul sense when I sing in Spanish. And I've heard that from other people. Like, I feel different when I sing in Spanish. And I think the audience also experiences my music in a different way when I sing in Spanish. And I've heard people say that. They're like, there's something different. Writing a song in Spanish is difficult for me. And so, yeah, because I mean, again, it's like being able to play with language that's not your mother tongue, I think can be hard. And so when I do write a song in Spanish, I'll show it to Hispanohablante and I'll be like, hey, like, how does this land? And they're like, yeah, I know what you're trying to do there, but it's not.
Well, that's surely a surprise listening to your music when you made the song La Que Manda.
Yeah.
Just seems so natural. And some of the other music that you've done. And so much of your success has come from not only melding language, but melding the types of music that you perform.
Yeah.
You were at the Kennedy Center and you performed I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor bilingually,
Yeah.
which I thought was really well done, first of all, but really, really interesting. So what has influenced your desire to explore these different forms of music and the different instruments that you play, and how much of being in the South, San Antonio, Austin, has really inspired and influenced you?
Yeah. I know. I think a lot of it is really just, I would say, curiosity and interest would be the biggest thing. So, when I look at, I've been doing this for, a couple decades now, at least. And so when I kind of, and I'm really returning to the early part of my career, to a lot of lessons I learned there and, just kind of reflecting on it. And I'm realizing, I'm like, oh man, so much of the magic then was me just following my curiosity. I went to Argentina. I did no research. I just thought it sounded cool. You know what I mean? Like, I did no research. Got there. And of course, like, their type of Spanish is super different. They're like, ¿Cómo te llamas? Vos? And I was like, what is happening? This is, this isn't Spanish. And it's like, no, it's not. It's Castellano. It's like the whole other thing, And, and I found the charango there, this beautiful, tiny 10-stringed instrument, and they're known for chacarrera music. The drum I have behind me actually is called a bombo legüero, and it's from Argentina. And so it's like I fell in love with these things. Doesn't make any sense being a person that's, from Texas with, Mexican and Swiss German roots, but I liked it. So it's kind of like, okay, let's just do that, And so I think in a lot of ways that was me kind of being in flow with the universe. And so I think a lot of what allows us to flow is when we're really more in touch with, who we are here in our heart and our body center. We, especially in the United States, like we live up here. Everything is so cerebral. And so it's kind of like dropping back into, to here. And I mean, like, look, we're all musicians. We've all literally got a drummer right here, And so it makes a lot of sense that music draws us back to ourself and ourselves, you know, and our communities.
Now, we've been talking a lot this afternoon about how borders aren't really real, like they're lines on a map. But this is also a podcast called Our New South. And so I think I'm glad you brought that up, because in some ways, when we talk about the South, it's not really about the South as a border on a map so much as it's the South as a state of being, state of mind. And with that in mind, pardon the pun, what is it about the South, and in particular being from Texas, that has influenced your work as an artist, as a musician? Because many folks, when we talk about Texas and we ask about its relationship to the South, we get very different responses. Some folks will say, well, yeah, Texas is part of the South. Other folks will say Texas is part of the West. And then still others will say, well, Texas is just Texas. And then we're not even getting into East Texas versus West Texas, Dallas versus San Antonio versus Austin versus so on and so forth, versus the border towns. But what for you makes the South important to your work as a musician and as an artist?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. So thank you all for having me on. I didn't know about your work before the invitation, and so I was listening to a few episodes and really love the podcast. So it's been added to my list. And you'll have some really great guests on. I'm not saying that because I'm on here, but
Very good.
but you know, it's interesting, like hearing other people's answers to this question, you know. And it's so funny because I think there's a lot of what, like who I am in the world and what I do, that is almost intentionally not what people think of as Texas. Meaning that, like, so it's kind of that concept, you know, we talked about earlier, we talked about kind of like that not fitting in, right? And I think when I think about music, it's like, here I am from Austin, where, you know, people think of as Willie Nelson, Stevie Ray Vaughan, like, you know, whoever it is, it's A, it's probably a man, and B, it's not what I do at all. And so there's this part of me that's like, oh, interesting. I didn't sit around and think up, oh, okay, I want to do something that's completely different. I think what I did is I created the kind of music that I wanted to hear, and it wasn't something that I grew up with. You know, it's like I was like, I've always kind of been like, okay, I have respect for like the greats of Austin, but it's not my thing. It's really not. And so I think in a lot of ways, like my existence is kind of defined by I'm not doing something different to be, you know, intentionally outsider. I think I'm doing something different to find a place for myself, because I didn't find it in the boxes that were provided. And so I think the South is just another thing like that. You know, it feels like there are definitely things about the South, you know, say for instance, it is like a slower pace, which I love. You know, I love going to bigger cities and getting the hustle and bustle and then coming back home and, like, you know, it's like taking a breath. You know, so there are some things that I do feel like are culturally like, you know, in general, people, you know, we say hi to each other and we're nicer and that kind of thing. I also think there's a lot about the South that has been defined by the people who have controlled it. And so the things that we think of, are they really the only definitions? So it's kind of like when you think about music, for instance, have you heard of Lydia Mendoza?
Yeah.
So she's called La Alondra de la Frontera, and the Lark of the Border. She was basically like they call her the mother of Tejano music. She played a 12-string guitar like a boss. You know, I think she was one of the first people, if not the first people, to actually like record music. And, you know, where's her statue? Like, I didn't grow up learning about her. And so I do think that there's a lot about the South that I'm interested in that are the stories that haven't been told. And so I'm finding that I'm like, oh, I never really felt like I belonged here. But guess what? That's all the more reason that I do.
Well, and you just mentioned that you were trying to situate yourself against what folks assume music from Austin or from Texas or from the South sounds like. So that begs the question, what is a Texas sound to you in terms of music?
I don't know. I mean, I do think there's a spirit of Texas. I don't think I would put a sound to it, to be honest, because I mean, I definitely don't play music that has any kind of lanes here in Texas. And at the same time, I would say that when I look at like the music of Lydia Mendoza, the music of Selena, and I continue that line, then I'm like, oh, if you're defining Tejano from Lydia Mendoza to Selena and onward, I 100% am in that lineage. But what Tejano has become since Selena's passing, I don't think I belong. So I don't know. It's definitions are always really, really tough. I think there's every kind of music in Texas. We have so many cool scenes.
You do. You do. And I heard you say at one point that something about fitting in not being a great thing because in order to fit in, you have to change yourself.
Mm.
And that you found yourself eventually by not having to fit in or conform to what people's expectations might be.
Yeah. Which is a Brene Brown quote. Got to throw that out there. And actually, I think Maya Angelou was the one who inspired Brene to dive into the understanding between fitting in and belonging. And they're actually like the opposite thing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And just following up a little bit on what you were discussing with Robert, but you had an interesting quote in that article with Brene, pointing you out as one of the important women in Texas to pay attention to. And you said, I would love it if Southern meant sharing and opportunity for everyone, which made it sound to me as if you have a desire for Texas to live up to that maybe it has not yet reached, or the South to live up to that it maybe has not yet reached. What did you mean by that?
You know, I think one of the things that popped into my mind that I do think a lot of people think of when it comes to the South is definitely, you know, Christianity, right? And that's one of those things where kind of depending on who you are and your experience, that could either be, you know, a 4-letter word or the best word, right? And I think for me, you know, I grew up Catholic and was so Catholic that I, you know, tried to pray my own gay away, literally, you know, considered joining religious life. Very, very, very Catholic, like Catholic nerd, like stay up till 3 a.m., like talking about consubstantiation and stuff. Okay. And at the same time, like I'm at a point in my life where, to be honest, I don't describe myself as Catholic anymore. It's hard to kind of put a word on what I feel. And yet I would say I'm very, 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 still very compelled by the person of Christ. I guess I'm bringing that up because there's parts of me that's like, I hate Texas and I love Texas. I hate Christianity and I love Christ. And if we're really trying to follow Christ, then we are doing largely the exact opposite of what these legislators who claim to be Christian are doing. You know, if we're going, Christ went to the margins and talked to the wrong people. Who's on the margin today? Immigrants, trans people, poor people, you know, whoever's not a white male is on the margin. And so, yeah, part of me is like, let's do that. Let's be Christ in this world.
And so do you try to, and I think that you do, reflect that in your music, those feelings?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. My very first album, I actually think was like somehow got like the metadata basically called it like a Christian album because, and when you listen to it, I mean, most of the songs are very like Christ-centered, I guess I would say, but it doesn't sound like Christian music, which is also kind of like I don't think Christian should ever be an adjective. The fact that there is like a Christian sound kind of makes me want to gag. You know what I mean? So I think, the topic wise, yes, that album was a Christian album, but sonically it really wasn't. And that wasn't my intention. But I guess I'm saying that to say that I've always been very driven by, in a journalistic way, kind of like speaking about real people and my real experiences and diving into the heart of them, which is kind of, I was a journalism major. We were talking about that earlier. And in a lot of ways, I do feel like the kind of music that I make, which is largely informed by folk and also Nueva Trova, which is kind of like the folk scene that came out of Latin America. And folk music, and I think rap music today is kind of the new folk, the idea that we're talking about real stuff and we're putting it in front of your face with a dope beat,
And since you brought up journalism, and then I'll kick it back to Robert, your mother, journalist, you go to school, you get a journalism degree, and you depart this noble profession. Music. What happened?
What happened?
Why did you make that turn?
So actually, my journalism degree has really aided my music career. I think not only because I'm able to, talk to people, interview people. The thing I loved about journalism was actually getting kind of like a backstage pass into people's lives. I mostly loved like kind of feature stories and stuff that was very, I get to go visit wherever and be like, hey, I'm writing a story, and people just open up. And I was like, whoa, this is crazy, And I feel like music is similar. My favorite part of a show is the merge table afterwards. Because, when you walk into a party, for instance, and maybe, like one person who's invited you, like there's that awkward, like you're just like, cool, what's your name? Where are you from? What do you do? You do all the like stupid little, surface level stuff you don't really care about. Well, after a show, you've all just had an experience together and people feel like they know you. And so the drop-in is immediate. And, people are like, oh my God, we bought tickets 6 months ago and we're the only lesbians for 50 miles and we're so glad you can, whatever, right? Whatever the thing is, and I get to just be like, oh my God, what's your name? Like, tell me your story. And I get that backstage pass into people's lives. And so that's the part that I really love. And I also, I'm now at a point in my life and my career where I'm so grateful for true journalists, especially because we've gone through it's gone, it's here, it's, it's blogs, it's it's social media, it's whatever. Because like by the time I graduated from UT journalism school, it kind of didn't exist. It was like this weird nebulous time where I was like, well, I don't really necessarily want to be a journalist, but the skills that I learned there, layout and design and photography and like stuff, all of that stuff has actually been really helpful in my music career. And now I feel like citizen journalism is so important. So I would not say that I left completely. I'm just in a different form of it.
Thank you.
And now, Gina, if you started out in history and then became a singer-songwriter, I would have said you chose wisely. But I will say that I'm glad that you mentioned your journalism background, and Kevin highlighted that because, again, as you said a moment ago, the kind of music you create is very much a present-day form of folk music, just like hip-hop, which I think is a really intriguing comparison. But I want to go back to something that you used to describe yourself a while back, which was you saw yourself as a married queer Catholic, so to speak. And you did speak about your faith a moment ago. Now, I find your backstory particularly intriguing in light of the history of LGBTQ folks in the South. I'm thinking in particular of icons like the trans icon Pauli Murray, for example. And I'm just curious as to how you see that part of your identity as being important both to your music making, but also to your identity as somebody from the South and from Texas.
Mm. Well, first, I'd just say, representation matters. And so I think that there's a reason we have the stereotypes we have about the South. There's a lot of reasons, kind of what we talked about earlier being that, depending on who's controlling Texas at that time, for one, depending on what agenda they have, depending on, who is allowed to kind of rise, has a statue, whatever the thing it may be. And so I think it's important to remember that, no single person, much less a community of people, much less an entire state of people, is singular, has a singular identity. And, and I think in and of myself, I know when I was really wrestling with my sexuality when I was 24, I didn't think I could be gay and Catholic. It was like breaking all parts of myself to be like everything I've ever been taught says that these things cannot exist in the same heart. And yet my experience told me, of course they do. Of course I can love my wife and my faith with the same heart. How would God love all three of us with the same heart? If we can't have interesting, nuanced ways of existing in the world, that is what makes us beautiful. Diversity is what makes it beautiful,
So I'm curious as to what you grew up listening to and what is it that still kind of influencing your musical styles even today?
Yeah, that's a great question, man. And I wish I'd grown up in a house that was, just full of music, but I kind of didn't. And so I do remember we did a lot of road trips because, I had family in Dallas and San Antonio. And so we were constantly just kind of driving back and forth. And I remember the cassette tapes that I remember loving were Lyle Lovett's Pontiac, Michael Jackson's Thriller.
Of course.
The Judds, I don't know which album. Little Richard, I think it was like a best of. And those are the cassette tapes that I remember like just loving. When I was in high school, the first band I went to go see was Third Eye Blind, who I actually got to open for this year on New Year's Eve in Austin, Texas, Auditorium Shores. That was freaking rad. I love a lot of Latin music, and I could definitely name some, but a lot of people's eyes start to glaze over because they don't know. So like Calle 13 was huge for me. Juanes, Natalia Lafourcade is more like contemporary. Also love like Brandy Carlisle. I will say when I started playing guitar, a lot of like folk artists. So Ani DeFranco, Patty Griffin, Nickel Creek. Those were huge influences when I first started playing guitar and writing songs. And then I cut my teeth on the guitar with like praise and worship music.
Well, music may not have been in the house, but it was certainly all around your upbringing. Whether it found you or you found it.
Yeah.
And now you're the musician that is being found, right? With the Musician of the Year awards in Austin, Best Female Vocals, the Latin Grammy nomination. Congratulations. Quite something. And somehow in between all of this, you found your way to El Salvador. And you have become a champion and a voice for girls and women to find themselves as you have found yourself. What was it about your experience in El Salvador that brought you to start the organization that you have to uplift girls and young women there?
It was 2008. The economy was tanking. I had just lost my job. My now wife, but girlfriend at the time, was in LA, had just come back from like a mission year with the Catholic worker and was part of like a Catholic mission program over there. And my friend reaches out to me and she's part of this. She's joined this like Catholic volunteer organization that sends people around the world to go work with youth. It's called Vides. And our friend Molly, and she reaches out to me on Facebook and she's like, hey, you should come do a concert for my girls. I'm teaching girls in Honduras, like they love your music. Haha, come play a concert for us. And so I was like, okay. So we signed up with the same organization because I was like, you know what? The economy's tanking. I don't have a job. You don't have a job. Like, let's get out of here. And so we basically signed up with this organization and said, send us somewhere Spanish speaking. And they sent us to El Salvador. And so we did meet up with Molly. We did play some songs for her girls. And then we played for we taught at an all-girls school that was run by Salesian nuns in the heart of the MS-13 gangs territory, La Mara Salvatrucha, in Soyapango, which is kind of like a suburb of San Salvador. And it changed our lives, We, of course, went to go do something good and, help the world, whatever. And, like many people, we received so much more love than we ever could have given, and it really changed our lives. We felt like family. We lived with some of the girls who lived at the school. And so they kind of became our sisters. And when we were leaving, it felt wrong to just be like, okay, cool. Now we're leaving. Bye, And so anyway, we were like, well, shoot, what can we do? We play some benefit concerts here. We start this college fund. And so lo and behold, 10 years later, 15 years later, we are still doing this. It's very small. And I kind of love that it's small. We have, so the first cohort of women were ones that we'd lived with. And then the second cohort was more through a process of applications and things like that. But we send them to the top rated private Catholic university in El Salvador called La UCA. And they're mostly 5-year programs. We pay for everything from academic fees, tuition, room and board. So we pay for where they're living. We also pay for transportation and food. And we also cover a 6-month paid internship program after they graduate.
That's fantastic. So you're not only leaving legacy with your music, you're leaving legacy with progeny that you've adopted, to educate. That's fantastic. Just listening to you speak and reviewing your music the last day or so, I don't think you could be you without being where you're from.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're very representative of. I lived in Texas, in Dallas, for 20 years, and I got around the state quite a bit. And as Robert alluded earlier, and you well know, and people who have been to Texas know, it's an extremely diverse state. Extremely. Yeah. One area is not like the other area. One big city is not like the other big city. One rural area is not like another rural area. You can go from coast with a beach to Grand Canyons and all the different types of people. And I just really think you're extremely reflective of that entire state in terms of what you do. And I really applaud you. I just applaud you for that. Supposed to ask you one question for sure. And we ask this of everyone. And it is, what does the phrase "the New South" mean to you?
Yeah, I was glad I listened to the other episodes so I could kind of get the minds rolling. No, just kidding. No, I really do think that I feel like the South has been largely defined by, for lack of a better term, our colonizers. And I think the New South is flipping the tables. That the people who have really made the South what it is are the South. And so the idea that the things, the flags that have flown over us and the people who have governed us no longer define who we are. We define who we are. And we are all of those beautiful things. We are the flower on the cactus and the spikes too. We are the rivers and the desert. We are at the top of the McDonald Observatory looking at all the stars, and we're at the coast and, dipping our feet in the third coast. So we are all of those things, and you can't necessarily pin us down.
And you're perfectly representative of that.
Well, I appreciate that.
And I have to say that was spoken like a true musician, a true artist. So thank you for that answer. And now, to end our episode today, we're going to do what we started doing this season, which is asking a series of rapid fire questions. I'm going to start us off this afternoon with the question that always gets people to really start thinking about their place in the South. Where is your favorite place to be in the South?
Good question. The first thing that's coming to mind is just with my wife, like anywhere. I think so much of my home is her. And even something as simple as in our hammock in the backyard, whether it's reading a book or looking at the stars. So
Nice. Sweet tea or Arnold Palmer?
sweet tea. Sweet tea. Although it's probably like a cane sugar vibe or like
There you go.
I'm one of those.
What's your favorite Southern word or phrase?
Ooh. Y'all. Come on. Y'all. It's gender neutral. It includes everyone. It's perfect. Everyone needs to use y'all. Everyone.
Great explanation.
All y'all.
Who is your favorite Southerner, living or dead?
A favorite Southerner. The first person that came to mind was Barbara Jordan.
Wow.
Oh.
Man, there's sometimes where I'm like, man, some of the people who lived when they lived and did what they did, looking how they look and being how they be, I'm like, damn, like Barbara Jordan, what a powerhouse. Thank God for her.
We're not going to sit by and watch the dissolution of the Constitution.
Yeah. We need to, we got to be channeling her spirit right now. You know what I'm saying?
I think we need 10 Barbara Jordans right now.
Amen. Get it.
And finally, in your estimation, what's the most underrated Southern food?
I want to say nopales, but I don't know that they'd be necessarily they should be a Southern food. Nopal, cactus.
Yeah.
I don't see nearly enough nopal like on the menu. You know what I mean? Like I think it should be more of a thing. Yeah, that's the first one that's coming to mind.
Can I just say, as someone who is from Georgia and now lives in South Carolina, I think your answer is the most unique one we've had this season because up until now, I never thought about eating cactus.
See?
Yep.
And yet, when people, that's the thing is like, if you, God forbid, had to walk through a desert, as people do to get here, you can subsist on cactus.
Yep.
As long as you can actually get to the meat of it. Man, throw that in some scrambled eggs. It's good.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this interview.
Oh my gosh. Thank you guys for having me on. And thanks to the whole team and for, hunting me down to actually get a date and stuff. Appreciate you guys being patient.
Thank you.
So Robert, we've talked about the many Souths, that's hard to say, that make up the New South. And now we've talked to a woman from the huge state of Texas who's a musician and plays and sings, it seems, everything from Latino music, Tejano music, R&B. I've heard her rap before in the middle of a song. She does it all. And you can't pin her down. We couldn't pin her down. She doesn't pin herself down. I think if she could pin herself down, I think that would be doing herself a disservice. But I just thought that she's just so representative of everything we've tried to do with this podcast, everything we've tried to reveal to the public, how the South is not a monolith. And even within the states, from people we talk to, their states are not monolithic either.
I think Gina Chavez in many ways represents something that has become a hallmark of our podcast, which is that the people who best understand the South as we know it, or as we think of it, as we conceive of it, are those who are traditionally seen as being on the margins of the South. And certainly Gina Chavez, as the daughter of folks who were descendants of immigrants, as someone who is queer, someone who is wrestling with her Christian faith, she represents the South as it actually is. And again, she spoke a lot about how we've let those in power really define what the South is, but now folks in the South are defining it for themselves. And again, just listening to her talk about all these different topics in a way that was not only holistic, but a way that was truly and deeply artistic was definitely a breath of fresh air.
Yeah. And after I started to delve into her music, which I was not familiar with before we started doing our show, she's really entertaining. And her music is extremely thoughtful, and it is political, as she alluded to during the show. And she's carrying on. And this is a period in this country maybe where artists can really shine and really, really do their thing. And Gina Chavez is certainly representative of that.
Absolutely. And I think I can speak for all of us here at Our New South when I say that I look forward to what she does next as both a musician and as an artist.
Well, that was a great conversation. But Robert, give the people some relief concerning the trivia question. What's the answer?
Now, to switch gears for a second, at the beginning of this episode, I asked you, which famous street is a hub for music in the city of Austin, Texas? A, Frenchman Street, B, 6th Street, C, Broadway, or D, Beale Street? The answer is B, 6th Street.
Wow, I knew that. I've been there a few times. Late at night, early in the morning. 6th Street is ground zero for live music in Austin, particularly the area between I-35 and Congress Street, which is affectionately known as Dirty Six. It features numerous bars and small music venues that participate in world-famous events like South by Southwest each year, while remaining a year-round attraction in the self-proclaimed live music capital of the world.
You know what I'm saying? It's like we got a demo tape and nobody want to hear it, but it's like this is South got something to say.
Our New South is presented by Levine Museum of the New South. Levine Museum connects the past to the future to realize the promises of a New South. To learn more and donate to projects like this, visit museumofthenewsouth.org.
Our New South is produced by Next Chapter Podcast. Thanks to our audio editor, sound designer, and composer, Cal Murdoch, video editor, Justin Cortez, producers Brian Douglas, Alexander Pineras, and Cliff Whitfield, senior producer and writer Byron Hunter, and executive producers Jeremiah Tittle and Frankie Abbott. Please follow the show, subscribe, rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and watch portions of our interviews on YouTube.
Go to youtube.com and search Levine Museum.
Learn more at nextchapterpodcast.com/Our New South.
The South got something to say.
Thanks for listening.
Next Chapter Podcasts.